said by Amy Stapleton, we are entering a new world. The technologies of machine learning, speech recognition, and natural language understanding are reaching a nexus of capability. The end result is that we'll soon have artificially intelligent assistants to help us in every aspect of our lives. A very warm morning to everyone. It's our pleasure to welcome all the participants today in this one-week faculty development program on artificial intelligence and machine learning organized by USMS DG5PU in collaboration with Science of Tech Services Private Limited. We welcome all the eminent speakers and guests from different domains to share their knowledge and vast experience with us. USMS is one of the most forward-looking and dynamic B school of the university, offering management programs with a distinct curriculum and teaching methodology. The MBA programs offered by USMS have been crafted with great care, keeping in view the future needs of business. They also reflect on the sensitivity expected from the upcoming managers to the changing aspirations of the community in a rapidly evolving technological environment. USMS offers MBA full-time program, MBA in financial analysis, PG diploma in data analytics, equity research, and entrepreneurship. And from this year, USMS is going to start a new program named MBA Analytics. USMS also offers 2-year executive MBA program for working professionals on weekend basis. SaaS of Tech Services is one of the leading providers of IT consulting and implementation services, which are specialized in data science as a service, BI solutions, and data analytics solutions to some of the finest organizations in India and abroad. We would like to welcome Professor Anil Saini, who is currently a professor and dean of the University School of Management Studies, director of Industry Interaction Cell, and a director of development of GGSIP University, New Delhi. He is the member secretary of Indraprastha Internal Quality Assurance Cell of the university. He has been a constant support and inspiration for the faculty members as well as the students of the school. Sir always motivates us to organize FDPs, workshops, seminars to enrich our skills. So we request you to kindly share a few words. I think sir is not here, so let's start with the first session of the day. We would like to introduce our keynote speaker for this FDP session, Dr. Arpan. He is the chair professor in the information systems area in the Department of Management Studies, IIT Delhi. He holds a joint appointment in the School of Artificial Intelligence. Administratively, he chairs corporate relations and is a member of Board Academic Program and Institute of Eminence Committee. His research and teaching interests are in the domain of data science, digital information, internet ecosystems, social media, and ICT-based public policy. In terms of teaching, he is the recipient of the Excellence in Teaching Award in 2017 by IIT Delhi based on teaching feedback of students. He has supervised 8 doctoral students and over 60 master's dissertations. Sir will be teaching us the theory building with big data analytics for social science and editorial perspective. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. So I'm trying to share my screen. Do let me know if the screen is visible.
Yes, her screen is visible.
Okay, thank you. So thanks for the invitation and the warm welcome. The discussion that I'm going to have today is surrounding theory building in big database studies in management and social sciences. So when we talk of all this focus on artificial intelligence, all this focus on methods which are coming in from machine learning, there are lots of journals which are basically looking at how can these methods be used to produce research articles which will have a lot more value. So what I'm going to share is basically an editorial perspective based on my experiences which I've seen across multiple journals. So what I'm going to share is how my journey started. So after I did my, my graduation, post graduation, and then PhD, I started working in the industry. I started my journey in IBM Research Lab, moved on to Cognizant Consulting, and from there I joined academics. So now it is my 11th year ongoing in academia. But in this journey, what I have been trying to focus is how can we use these machine learning kind of methods. And when we use this machine learning kind of methods, how can we produce papers which are really, really highly impactful? They are published in the top journals like A and E star journals. And typically, if you look at my career history till now, I have more than now 160 papers, out of which around 55, 60 are really considered to be A category publications like ABDCA or ABS3 or Impact Factor Q1. These are typically the journals that we typically focus on. And besides this, my personal experience as an associate editor in many journals, like different journals, Information System Frontiers, then different journals like Global Journal of Flexible Systems Management. Then in e-governance, I take care of few journals like in Journal of Public Affairs, Journal of Electronic Government Research, and I'm editor-in-chief of a journal which is specifically focusing on, big data-driven theory building research, which is published from Elsevier, which is International Journal of Information Management, Data Insights. So what I'm going to talk about is predominantly based on these experiences of as an associate editor in many journals and also as a special issue editor in many A-star journals like International Journal of Information Management, Industrial Marketing Management. These are all A-star journals. And what kind of research typically gets through in these kind of high quality, high impactful journals? That's what predominantly I'm going to talk about today. So as I said, this is an editorial perspective. This is the journal that I manage in Elsevier. It is a companion journal to International Journal of Information Management, which is an A-star journal, but this is a relatively newer journal. But if you look at this journal, what we are trying to achieve is what I'm going to talk about today. The article that I'm going to talk about is already published in International Journal of Information Management, which is an A-star journal and has an impact factor above 18. So the perspective that I'm going to talk about is already published. So if you have to understand more about the perspective, you should go and read this article and build, your research papers, build your academic journey surrounding the directions which are given in this research articles. So if you look into this paper, we provide an editorial perspective of how should you undertake big data-driven research? What makes big data-driven research publishable? So this is slightly different because we're talking of a business context. We're talking about a management researcher who is going to use big data-driven research. So the context is slightly different from somebody who is going to come from a pure computer science discipline. So what we are talking about is how should management researchers who are familiar with machine learning, who are familiar with analytics and tools, they should undertake big data-driven research so that they can contribute in decent, good journals, good platforms, and then subsequently build up their career. Because today, if you look at all the different platforms, irrespective of whether it is Indian or national or international rankings, for example, international rankings like QS rankings, they give a lot of weightage to the average citation per faculty. They give a lot of weightage to how many high impact factor or Q1 publications are brought out by the faculty. Similarly, NIRF ranking, if you look at, that is published from Ministry of Education, they also look at how good the faculty members are for an institution when it comes to producing research. And this weightage has 30% weightage on institutional rankings. The single factor of research and its impact has got 30% weightage in international and national rankings. And this is where it becomes very important that the faculty members who start teaching you, the faculty members who are looking to extend and strengthen their career, they have a strong foundation in research. So when we started this journey, it was in 2018. Although we started, doing this or adopting this methodology from 2014, but I would say that it was in 2018 when we started working on this paper, and the paper got published in 2020. But this particular study has been echoed. The kind of methodologies, the kind of philosophy that we are talking about has also been echoed in the editor's comment in Management Information Systems Quarterly, which is also an FT journal and is considered to be the most, difficult journal to crack. And MIS Quarterly, then Information Systems Research. Both of these journals have started echoing similar thought process that if you are doing computationally intensive, research in information systems and in systems theory development, then what kind of philosophy should you adopt? What is it that editors and journals typically look for when they're looking at any kind of article which is showcasing some promising dimensions of what constitutes a quality contribution? Any questions till now?
No, sir.
Okay, thank you. So I'll give little bit more background for the research agenda. These days, what has happened is data is available for free in multiple platforms, whether you call it as a UCSI platform or whether you call it as data in brief, which is published through Elsevier, whether it is, Caltech's platform, or whether it is something like open data platforms which are published from the government, or whether it is platforms like social media, like Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, and so on. What has happened is there is a huge access to data. Earlier, when researchers used to kind of focus on any kind of research problems, and if you have to validate a model, then the biggest challenge was how do you get access to the data? But these days, getting access to data is not a challenge. So, what started happening around 2015, 2017, we started seeing that there is a huge amount of studies which are starting picking up, which are using data which are easily accessible, data which is collected for some purpose and then stored in the public repository. We are having access to that free data, and so building a computational model, building some kind of a mathematical model, and demonstrating that research by analyzing the data became, very, very visible. And that basically led to a growth in big data driven research. And typically, the criticism that came out in that all big data driven research, unless it is carefully grounded in theory, most of the times that there is a lack of theory, there is a lack of a theoretical perspective, which makes the results applicable, generalizable to a larger context. So what happened that all these research papers which started, you know, kind of using this big data, which are coming in from all these different free platforms, these started getting a lot of editorial rejects, or they were not passing, especially in the good journals. I'm not talking about relatively ordinary journals or easier journals to crack, but typically, if you look at the good journals, if you're doing this research and you're not getting through, the result is basically most of the times these research do not have any theoretical contribution. So the focus of the talk that I'm going to give today is how can we move beyond the what is there in the data towards why those instances, why those findings are obtained from the data. Can we move towards a why element in the research questions rather than what is there in the data? So this is what a theoretical contribution would indicate. So if you look at any kind of research that typically starts off, the first thing is we have to ideate the research. That if we do a research, that is very nice, but it is important that the research has to be, uh, you know, kind of publishable in a good platform. If the research is publishable in a good platform, for that we need to have mechanisms in which the research can be evaluated on the basis of three parameters. The first is timeliness of the research, whether what you're exploring today is still relevant today. For example, I'll give a personal example for all of these. There is a team of Australian collaborators who reached out to me that they have done a meta analysis of research. So, meta analysis is a kind of literature review in which statistically, using methods like MASM, you try to explain that, okay, this particular model which has been used across, say, 100 different studies or 200 different studies, how different relationships are validated, how different relationships are strong enough, and you try to account for population diverseness, population size in across all the studies to come to a theoretical model. Now, the team which approached me, they spoke about TAM, and technology acceptance model is extremely, extremely valuable. There has been so much of impact from the technology acceptance model. But the thing is that TAM has been there for the last 20 decades, and there has been, more than maybe 20,000 papers which have used TAM. And today, or for the last 10 years or last 15 years, TAM is no longer exciting unless there is something very new that is coming out. So, when the researchers reached out to me saying that they want to explore the study in TAM, the fundamental premise, the fundamental challenge that I shared with them is that, okay, TAM is an exciting area in terms of theory, it is a very good theoretical model, but today TAM is not timely enough. If you had undertaken this study maybe 15 years ago, then that meta analysis or that topic or the scope of research that you're trying to do might have gone through in a decent journal. But if you're doing this today, then there is super saturation in that area. So it is not timely, although the topic that you are undertaking is good. It is really novel, it is exciting, it is theoretically very rich, but it is not timely enough. It was probably timely if you had undertaken that research 15 years back. The next thing is it has to be relevant to the audience. And the relevance to the audience is basically evaluated on the basis of few parameters. Parameters could come in from how you are resonating with the general audience. For example, if I'm developing a research paper which is predominantly focusing on, say any specific discipline, say it is in uh, some discipline like tourism or some discipline like sports. Now, I have applied methods of big data driven research, which is relevant in information management, but my area, my core references are basically borrowing theory, which is from a different discipline. I need to be very careful about understanding that if I'm going to share my story, if I'm going to share my research to an audience of a different discipline, then probably my research paper is not really relevant to that discipline. I have to understand and assess that if I'm talking of a research, even if it is interdisciplinary, there has to be a core. And the core has to be something that we need to identify for a research, that where is the core? Is the core between two areas? It can be between two areas, which is say marketing and IS, or say operations and IS, or marketing and operations, but it should not be beyond that. Because if it is beyond that, then probably you're diluting the core. So the relevance with audiences for particular journal is going to be diluted. And what you're talking about has to be novel enough. So if the article has findings which are novel enough that nobody else has talked about it, then that is where basically the topic has some traction. Once you are able to handle these three, then basically you think of the editorial perspective that the editor is going to assess your study from three viewpoints: the generalizability of your findings, the rigor with which you have validated and arrived at those findings, and the relevance of the contribution to the authorship or the audience of the journal. These are three things that editors typically would look for when they are evaluating any submitted manuscript. Understand something. Any ordinary journal also, if it is say published from a decent publisher like Elsevier, Taylor Francis, Wiley, and so on, it would be getting 1,000 manuscripts in a year. A popular journal probably would be getting around 4,000, 5,000 manuscripts in a year. The editor who is sitting there simply does not have time to go through your manuscripts with a lot of detail and try to see how your manuscripts can be customized, how your manuscripts can be crafted, and over periods of iteration can fit a particular audience. The editor would not have time for all this purely because his job is free, his administrative load, his academic load, his responsibilities in the university are never wavered off because of his editorial role. Editorial role is something that one person does on top of all other activities by taking out time in the early morning, by taking out time in the midnights. So his job is really, really cumbersome. And this is where basically it is important that if you are to go through and sail through a journal, you have to make his task a little easier. So editors would use certain proxies for ascertaining whether an article can potentially blow up into a manuscript that is publishable in the journal. So he would use these proxies as mechanisms to assess whether an article has potential or not. Any questions till now?
No, sir.
Okay. So when editors would typically evaluate any good journal, any good submission to a journal, they would try to understand whether there is uniqueness, whether there is parsimony, and whether there is generalizability in the theoretical perspective which is shared. And typically, like whenever you were talking of any manuscript submission, we talk about the reproducibility of the results. So if somebody else was undertaking the same research, whether the results were reproducible. What is the level of falsifiability of the results? To what extent there is internal consistency in how the results were obtained and interpreted? Would the study have a test of time? So these are some important elements that is typically there. But for most of the time, when faculty members or young researchers would use any machine learning based approach, any AI/ML based approach for developing any research papers, there is always this dilemma of whether my contribution is in the methods or whether my contribution is in domain. And by contribution in domain, we mean that there has to be a theoretical contribution. So what it means is, if I blow this out, the method versus discipline contribution or domain contribution, a methodological contribution means that you are bringing out something very new in the algorithm development itself, which means that in the algorithm, either through a pure mathematical lemmatization, you are saying that this particular algorithm is better, this particular extension of the algorithm is better, or under these contexts this algorithm would operate better. So you define basically how the algorithm, the theory surrounding the algorithm is improved, the theory surrounding the algorithm is enriched. But that is not where we are talking about, because that is what typically is undertaken by people who are mainly from computer science, who are working in computer science departments. But what constitutes a theoretical contribution is when you're trying to explain something more about the discipline. Something more about the discipline could be related to, say, how you are able to use these machine learning algorithms and say something meaningful, something new about disciplines like in marketing, say it is related to customer experiences, or you are able to say something new about new disciplines which are emerging. And these new disciplines, what you're talking about, are related to areas like, say, customer churn. It could be something like newer areas of human resource management, just like you're talking about employee engagement, or rather disengagement. Or if you say that you are working in space of human resources, you are trying to understand what creates deviating behavior or deviation behavior among employees. So what I'm talking about is the research question, which is basically driven by a theoretical lens, which is explaining something about the discipline. The idea is to explain something about the discipline. And in management or social sciences, we are typically focusing on the discipline. We are not focusing on the methodological contribution. For methodological contribution, people who are coming in from IT or CS or even electronics background, they would look into how they can build up an artificial intelligence algorithm, how they can create extensions of understanding within the AI algorithm. That is not our role. Our role is to use AI/ML algorithms, but we are trying to contribute something very, very categorically in the theory so that our paper, our research paper makes some extensive extension, makes some fundamental understanding surrounding that discipline. Discipline could be marketing, could be OBHR, could be related to information systems, could be related to operations, could be related to international business, but we are trying to make a contribution there. So it is important to understand that the data and its description is not theory, and citing literature itself is not theory. But data and its description and literature helps to build theory. So if you are having a theoretical framework adopted from any discipline, could be related to that you're talking of, say, consumer experiences, and you borrow the theoretical literature which is coming in from, say, service quality assessment, then that is a theoretical framework which you are borrowing from the literature. Alternatively, if it is something like another discipline, like, say, you're looking at customer experiences, you can borrow theoretical literature surrounding behavioral intention. If it is related to adoption, you can build theoretical literature, or you can build theory or borrow theory from areas like UTaught model, math model, and so on and so forth. The idea is basically when we are borrowing this literature, we have to borrow one or two typical major theoretical lenses through which we are viewing the phenomena. The theoretical lenses allows us to have a more objective mechanism in which we are able to view the phenomena. Of course, we cannot view the entire phenomena, because the phenomena by itself, any problem statement by itself, can have multiple perspectives. And we as researchers, we know that it is not possible to build upon all the perspectives. What we have to build upon is limited number of perspectives. And for doing that, what we try to do is we try to ensure that the perspective that we are taking is built upon a solid theoretical lens. If the solid theoretical lens is there, what happens is we would be having any kind of understanding. We'd be having any kind of inferences that we are building upon, that are kind of built upon robust building blocks. So there was a lot of debate which started in the 1995, mid 1990s, what theory is not. And you guys should go and read this debate. And this debate says that when management education started, Sutton and Straw brought out this article in Administrative Science Quarterly that adding references are not theory, data and its descriptions are not theory, the list of variables and constructs are not theory, and imagery is not theory. The first two are fairly easy to understand. That adding references do not build up to theory but helps in building it. Data and its description is not theory but helps in building it. But what is a theory comes out when you are having a mix of constructs and then you do not have linkages establishing some relationship among the constructs. So if you have constructs, if you have variables which are already established as having some relationship, and you're not strengthening or talking about anything new about how those relationships can be better understood, then you're not really contributing anything theoretical. So imagery and list of variables or constructs just by borrowing from theoretical blocks is not going to work as theory. And in this context, Professor Varun Grover brought out a very nice article. He brought out this article that people who are focusing on big data driven research, typically they would be focusing a tendency to address tactical problems, which is operational in nature. And typically, there are no scope for abstracting that problem to a level where it is very, very generalizable, abstracting the problem in such a way that it addresses something more grander. And then big data driven research will result in widespread diversity, but it will not go into causality research. Management research or social sciences research needs to move towards causality. And big data driven research is typically focusing away from causality. It is not focusing into moving in a direction for explaining causality, but most of the times, whenever you're using big data driven research, you're just mining the data, producing nice visualization, which are very interesting, definitely. They're very informative, but it does not move towards a direction to explain why certain phenomena are observed in the data. So the causal elements, why some observations are visible, that is not really there. The next thing is more from a viewpoint of somebody who is focusing on information systems, that big data driven research, because you are focusing on the data too much and the availability of the data too much, so you're not really aligned with any kind of strong discipline focused ground. And in case of information systems, the IT artifact, which is the code or any kind of information systems, is typically defined that there will be use, and you're trying to explore the use or impact of any IT artifact among certain communities or among certain stakeholders. So big data driven research will exhibit a bias towards a nominal treatment of any such discipline artifact that is there. And typically, they will exhibit a bias towards a very superficial treatment of theory and focus more on the data and methods. And these are some of the perils which has been brought out of big data driven research in 2020, when in 2018, 2019, suddenly there was a huge splurge of big data driven research coming out. And besides this, the other elements of big data driven research, which Professor Grover also brought out, that most of the times, whenever we are undertaking this AI ML based research, we are only focusing on what we can predict. And our knowledge that a typical manuscript, a typical study should generate is all about how we can explain some phenomena. What are the causality in that phenomena that we are able to explain? We are not focusing on there at all most of the times. And big data driven research is historical and subjected to biases. Like if there are specific types of behavior which are witnessed in, say, liking of specific post made in, say, an e-commerce platform like Amazon. Say suppose there are product ratings in Amazon, and then subsequently at a later point of time, if the initial 10 product ratings are good, the 11th and the 12th person also feel inclined to give a good product rating. Similarly, if the initial product ratings are bad, then subsequently the 11th and 12th person are inclined to giving a adverse product rating. So big data is often historical and subject to different kinds of biases. So we need mechanisms in which we are able to address these biases if we are exploring big data driven research. The data is often subject to streetlight effect, which basically means that access to the data is driving your research agenda and not the research questions that you're asking. So this is a question, this is a problem of problematization, that you have the data, you are undertaking a study, but why is it important to undertake the study? What is it that is so pressing? What is it that is so much of a gap in existing literature which forces you to or compels you to undertake that study? That streetlight effect is visible in many big data driven research. And typically, the big data driven research would not focus on developing strategic questions. The inclination would be to mine the data that they see and tactical questions which can be answered. There is no focus on very long term strategic questions that organizations or stakeholders might face whenever you're talking about big data driven research. So these are the problems that as an editor, we often see, as a reviewer, also we often see that many a time whenever young faculty members, young researchers, they are undertaking big data driven research, they find that it is very difficult to break into a decent journal. So what is needed? So this is what has been brought out, that in recent things, that many a times we are focusing a movement from deductive theory building to inductive theory building. So whenever we are trying to move towards inductive theory building, the idea is either the area of research or phenomenon is so new that it is not really having adequate research, or it is not having adequate knowledge in that discipline. Because there is not much of adequate knowledge in that discipline, so a person typically would start with, I'm sorry, I think there are some questions here. I'm not able to see the questions. Okay, so you're talking about on the importance of grounded theory approach in the context of big data research. Yes, so I'll discuss about it. So uh, if you're talking about grounded theory approach, so grounded theory approach is a inductive theory based approach. So you would typically go for an inductive theory based approach if the area that you are exploring is very, very new. And big data driven approaches are basically when either the area is very new or there is theoretical saturation. And majority of the times, a grounded theory approach or a big data driven approach is undertaken either because there is theoretical saturation in the discipline, because there are too many papers, too many studies which have been undertaken, and there is no possibility of identifying newer relationships which has already not been kind of demonstrated or established. But in an inductive theory approach, what happens is, if the discipline is very new, the phenomena is very new, and there has been no prior exploration of the phenomena, you would also try to kind of explain why that phenomenon needs little bit of deep dive into. And by deep diving into, what we mean is that such a phenomena, say COVID happened, and because COVID happened, in these last 2 years there was unprecedented behavior of specific user groups could be social media user groups could be, say, newspaper user groups. And then you were trying to understand, do specific types of behavior, say misinformation or fake news in social media, lead to any kind of adverse or any kind of impact? And that area, that information or fake news during pandemic, which has never been precedented, lead to any kind of outcome behavior. Say the outcome behavior is, say, panic buying. So if this is the kind of study that you're trying to establish the relationship, because there has been no trial literature which has talked about this area, then you can go with an inductive theory building, because you won't have deductive theory to justify your theoretical framework. But even if you're going with inductive theory building, you can go with big data driven research methods. Or if you're looking at smaller, interview based or qualitative research based methods in which the sample size is small, you can probably, move towards a research methodology which is more towards grounded theory. The idea is how you can open up black boxes of unreachable phenomenon. By big data driven research, what we mean is, or in inductive research, what we mean is that if certain relationships were already established, there is no point of visiting and going for a big data driven research in that. But if you're trying to identify new factors, which inductive theory building can potentially allow you to reach, then it is important that we can try to open up those black boxes, identify new constructs, identify new theoretical tenets, which will be explaining that phenomenon slightly better. And that is what an inductive theory building approach becomes very important. So we try to basically have methods which are coming in from AI/ML, artificial intelligence, machine learning, text mining, natural language processing, and so on. And we are trying to look at some data which is coming in from different sources, could be coming from sensors and actuators, could be coming in from, say travel related data coming in from Google Maps, and that is mobile crowd sensing, sensors. So mobile crowd sensing sensors like Google Maps giving you data, and then we are trying to generalize about the patterns which are surfacing from the data. The patterns that we surface from the data is what we are getting out of methods. The methods enable us to get the patterns surfacing from the data, and that has to be abstracted so that we can reach theorizing. So, theory building for IS or any kind of social sciences for big data driven studies has to start off with a broader literature gap, saying that this has not been really explored in literature. There is a significant gap in the literature, and then we need to understand the context of the phenomenon very well. And we need to create research questions with hypotheses that we will be able to validate about relationships among constructs or relationship among, the building blocks of the phenomena. And we need to validate it using statistical analysis. So starting off is, again, we need to borrow from theoretical lenses which are coming in from social sciences on management, identify the core, and we can borrow some from the related disciplines, but we need to have a very distinct core. And if we are not able to focus on the core, then whatever we borrow from related disciplines, that's not going to cut the ice, because we don't have a core. We don't have a core theory. So any journal worth its salt would typically want to publish any manuscript which is aligned with the core discipline that it is from, unless it is a very general management kind of journal. And of course, there are journals which are very, very general management, like, journals like management research review, journals of business research. These are general management journals. But if you're not having a general management journal, then a journal would typically want your manuscript to resonate with its audience. So having the code is very important because then you would be able to resonate with a functional discipline. And so your journal choice is more driven by your functional discipline. Okay, Satyajit, you had a question that big data driven research is all about prediction and not focused on explanation and causality. Okay, so what happens is, I'll in fact go into this once I start moving into the methods once. I'll just come to this question once I start talking about the methods very soon, very soon. Okay, so majority of the time, what happens is whenever we are trying to talk about the research methodology, any kind of research which is undertaking using big data or any kind of general research methodology is we need to think of how, if we're looking at the phenomenon, whatever insights or whatever take we have on that phenomenon, that has to be replicable by somebody else if he's also going to look in the phenomenon. So if there is a different team who is going to look into the phenomenon, is there a mechanism that he also arrives at my, propositions or my takeaways from the data if he's revisiting that phenomenon? How can we do that? But what happens is most of the time, big data driven research has a lot of noise, and we do not have mechanisms for addressing, or rather, the many of the studies don't have mechanisms for addressing how measurement is being addressed. So what happens is you need to have mechanisms in which you're bringing in some reporting of how you are introducing reliability in the measurements, validity in the measurements. And you can use text mining, natural language processing, network science, and all these things. But unless you are able to bring some objectivity to the models, whether it is through reliability or validity or robustness checks, other robustness checks, then what happens? The analysis that you're doing may not have the similar resonation or may not have the similar interpretation by the other people or the other teams who are looking at the same data maybe, but maybe their models are different, maybe their methods are different, but they arrive at very different interpretation. The idea for a good research is that if somebody follows the same steps, will he come at the same conclusions or not? So that objectivity is basically brought in when you are having distinct thought processes in your mind of how to establish reliability and how to establish validity. And majority of the articles, especially from India, Malaysia, a majority of these articles are typically rejected because they do not have a very strong methodological rigor in terms of how they report reliability and validity, and the theoretical linkages are really poor. Most of the times, most of the research which is brought out, the theoretical linkages are very poor, and the methodologies don't have anything to report on reliability and validity. So what I'm talking about, big data driven research is all about prediction and not focused on explanation. What I mean here is, whenever you are trying to talk about big data driven research, you are running some fancy, methods which are coming from big data like text mining, network modeling, image mining, video analysis, which is still at a nascent stage. But after you do that, you are basically presenting descriptive statistics about the data. Suppose I capture all the discussions which are happening today on any phenomenon, maybe it is on stock markets. So yesterday, a lot of FIIs invested on the stock market, so I'm trying to capture all the chatter. Now, if I use big data driven methods, I capture the chatter, say in social media, and then I analyze it today. Maybe the last 4 days, last 5 days, all that chatter that has happened, how FII invested more in India equity markets, I captured that chatter. Now I can use text mining, natural language processing, and then analyze that. Suppose I do a sentiment analysis of that. Now, when I do the sentiment analysis of that data, I will get okay, say 40% of the people were negative about the Indian stock market in the last 5 days, 50% were positive about it, and 10% were neutral. Very nice. I get this as after I do a sentiment mining. Now, 10 days after, suppose I collect the data again for 5 days and I can get a large amount of data, say on the Indian stock market, maybe I've got maybe 5 million social media posts. Again, when I do the data and I do the sentiment analysis, I see that, okay, maybe 30% people were neutral, 70% people were positive. So the data set has changed, the context remains same, my interpretation all goes for a toss. Because my interpretation goes all for a toss purely because earlier I was just focusing on seeing what extent, how much percentage of the social media posts were positive, how what percent of the social media posts were negative. It does not really abstract and create knowledge beyond that. But what could have created knowledge is if we could look at the data and say that, okay, what are the tenets or what are the discussion elements or the topics in the discussion or themes in the discussion which leads to a variation in the sentiments? Or do this discussion or do these themes, when they're discussed about, lead to a variation in predicting the stock market next day? If I could abstract from the discussion of big data driven research, then I'm moving towards causality research. I know that, okay, if people start discussing about XYZ themes, and these XYZ themes are abstractable using a theoretical lens, then this theoretical lens allows me to objectively view at the this huge corpus of text and explain why certain tenets or certain elements or certain factors are responsible for the variation in the observed variable, observed phenomena. And that observed phenomena you're measuring using a dependent variable, and that dependent variable could be something like, say, how the stock market is changing. So if I could do that, then I would be moving towards an explanatory study. Then I would be moving towards a causality study. But most of the times, what I do is I would typically focus on just running the algorithm on the data and then say that, okay, this percentage of data are positive, negative, neutral, or these are the main topics which are coming in from the data. These are the word clouds from the data. Yes, very fine. That is describing the data. Or these are the networks and communities from the data. But what is it? Why certain phenomena is observed? We forget to explain the phenomena. We forget to explain the causality behind the phenomena. And a good research question comes whenever we are using any kind of BDR methods, any kind of ML methods, we can explain that causality. If we are able to explain that causality, what happens is we are in a position to generalize and abstract and create knowledge from data. Data, when it is mined and represented through nice visualization, that is information. But that information has to be abstracted so that we can explain why that phenomenon is observed in a particular way. If we can explain that why, then we are moving towards that knowledge. The idea for any kind of research is to move towards that causality. Satyajit, when you're talking about explainable AI, it has nothing to do with causal research. Explainable AI is more about when you are using the methods of AI, but then, for example, when you're talking about neural networks, we don't know what happens within the black box of neural networks. like what are the relative importance of each input variable in a neural network. So if there are 10 different, variables in a neural network, and those variables are impacting the final classification